He hadn't heard another human voice in nearly 10 years. He hadn't heard his own music in even longer. And on the night he finally died, in the middle of a violent thunderstorm, his own doctors still couldn't agree on what, deep down, had actually been wrong with him all along. His name was Ludwig van Beethoven. The date was March 26, 1827. And the question that has followed him for 2 centuries is deceptively simple. Did the disease that stole his hearing also kill him? That's the case we're opening today on Clue Series. Not just the story of how one of history's greatest composers went deaf, but a real investigation into whether that deafness and his death were ever actually connected. For a long time, historians treated these as 2 separate stories. One tragedy, a musical genius who went deaf. Another tragedy, decades later, a sick man who died of liver failure. 2 unrelated cruelties, stacked on top of one another by bad luck. But in the last 20 years, something changed. Scientists got their hands on real physical evidence. Locks of his hair, preserved and passed down since the night he died. And when modern laboratories finally analyzed them, they found something nobody expected. A single hidden thread that may connect the silence in his ears to the failure of his organs. We're going to walk through this case the way the evidence actually unfolds. How Beethoven went deaf, how his body slowly turned against him, and how 2 centuries later, science finally went looking for the clue he left behind in his own hair. If you are into real historical mysteries backed by actual evidence, not guesswork, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case. Now back to Vienna and the man who kept composing after the music went silent. The boy in Bonn. Ludwig van Beethoven was born in December of 1770 in the small German city of Bonn, into a family that was, by any measure, unstable. His grandfather had been a respected court musician. His father was not nearly as talented and drank heavily, and saw in his young son something he could exploit. A prodigy, a second Mozart, a meal ticket. The father drilled the boy at the keyboard for hours, sometimes dragging him out of bed in the middle of the night, drunk, insisting he play for visitors. Neighbors later remembered hearing a small child crying at the piano long after dark. It was not a gentle education. It was closer to conscription. And yet the talent was real. By his early teens, Beethoven was already working as an assistant organist at the Bonn court, already composing, already being noticed by people who mattered. In 1787, at 16, he traveled to Vienna, possibly to meet Mozart himself, though the details of that trip remain frustratingly thin. He was called home almost immediately. His mother was dying. Within a few years, his mother was gone, his father had drunk himself into uselessness, and Ludwig, barely out of his teens, found himself the head of the household, responsible for his 2 younger brothers. He grew up fast, and he grew up hard. Friends from this period describe a young man who was brilliant, restless, occasionally rude, and almost impossible to keep up with at the keyboard. By 1792, Bonn could not hold him anymore. A group of noble patrons pooled money to send him to Vienna, the music capital of Europe, to study with the aging Joseph Haydn. Beethoven packed his life into a coach and left the town of his childhood. He would never live there again. Vienna Calling. Vienna in the 1790s was the center of the musical universe, and Beethoven arrived like a storm. He was not at first famous as a composer. He was famous as a performer, a pianist so ferocious and so unpredictable that rival musicians reportedly avoided challenging him to public keyboard duels, a popular pastime among the city's aristocracy. He improvised for hours. He bent the rules of harmony until audiences didn't know whether to be thrilled or offended. He was rough around the edges, badly dressed, indifferent to noble titles at a time when composers were still expected to bow and scrape for their patrons. Beethoven did not bow. He believed with total sincerity that his talent made him the equal of any prince in the room, and he said so. Remarkably, Vienna's aristocracy loved him for it, or at least tolerated him for it. Wealthy patrons competed to support him. Publishers fought over his compositions. By his late 20s, Beethoven was, by the standards of the time, a genuine celebrity, independent, in demand, and finally free of his father's shadow. He should have been at the peak of his life. Instead, quietly, almost invisibly at first, something had already started to go wrong. The sound that wouldn't stop. Around 1798, when Beethoven was 27 years old, he began to notice a ringing in his ears that would not go away. Tinnitus, doctors would later call it, a constant internal hiss and hum that never switched off, day or night. At first, he told almost no one. For a musician, hearing is not simply one sense among five. It is the entire instrument of the profession. Beethoven understood immediately what was at stake, and for years he tried to hide it, terrified that word would get out and destroy his career before it had truly begun. In 1801, he finally confided in a childhood friend back in Bonn, a young physician named Franz Wegeler. In a letter, he described his condition with brutal honesty. For 3 years, his hearing had been growing steadily weaker, he wrote, and he suffered from a strange kind of deafness where quiet conversation vanished into nothing, while loud sounds became almost unbearable to endure. He begged Wegeler to keep the letter private. He tried everything the medicine of the era had to offer. Almond oil dripped into his ears, herbal tonics, cold baths in the Danube, devices strapped to his arms that were supposed to draw the bad fluids away from his head, a treatment straight out of the previous century's medical playbook. None of it worked, because none of it was treating anything real. Beethoven's doctors, like every doctor of his time, were essentially guessing. By 1802, on the advice of his physician, he retreated to a quiet village outside Vienna called Heiligenstadt, hoping that rest and isolation might somehow slow the damage. It did not, and it was there, alone, that his hearing loss pushed him to the edge of something far darker than a medical complaint. The letter he never sent. In October of 1802, in that rented room in Heiligenstadt, Beethoven sat down and wrote a letter to his two brothers. It was never sent. It was found among his papers only after his death, 25 years later, folded away in a locked drawer. Today, it's known as the Heiligenstadt Testament, and it reads less like a letter and more like a confession, or a suicide note that talked itself back from the edge. Beethoven describes in raw and painful detail what his hearing loss had actually cost him. He writes of standing beside a friend in a field, hearing a distant shepherd's flute, and realizing his companion could hear it clearly, while he, Beethoven, heard nothing at all. He describes the humiliation of avoiding social gatherings, letting people assume he was arrogant or antisocial, rather than admit the truth. He describes considering ending his life. And then, in the same document, he pulls back. He writes that it was only his art, only the music still unwritten inside him, that stopped him from following through. He resolves to keep living, keep composing, keep fighting, whatever his ears would or would not allow him to hear. It's one of the most remarkable documents in the history of Western music, precisely because of what happened next. Beethoven did not fade away after Heiligenstadt. He returned to Vienna, and over the following decade produced some of the most ambitious, most defiant music anyone had ever written. Symphonies that shook concert halls, a body of work so bold that historians still refer to this stretch of his career as his heroic period. He was disappearing into silence, and somehow it made the music louder. Living in silence. Playing by feel. As the 1800s wore on, Beethoven's hearing loss only deepened, and he adapted the way any resourceful, stubborn person adapts to a slow-motion catastrophe. Piece by piece, tool by tool. He experimented with primitive hearing aids, metal ear trumpets, cone-shaped devices built by Viennese craftsmen, designed to funnel sound directly into his ear canal. They helped a little for a while, with certain sounds at certain distances. He carried several different models depending on the situation. None of them restored what he'd lost. They only slowed the retreat. He discovered, almost by accident, that he could still perceive music through vibration. Visitors described watching him saw the legs off a piano so he could set the instrument directly on the floor, then kneel down and press his body against the wood, feeling the notes travel up through the frame and into his bones. Other accounts describe him clenching a wooden rod between his teeth, the other end resting against the piano case, letting the vibrations travel straight through his jaw. It sounds almost unbelievable. It is, by multiple contemporary accounts, true. By around 1818, Ordinary conversation had become essentially impossible without help. Beethoven began carrying small paper notebooks everywhere he went, and visitors would write their side of the conversation down so he could read it and respond aloud. Historians call these his conversation books, and more than 100 of them survive today, a strange and intimate written record of a man's social life, conducted almost entirely in silence. You can read in his friends' handwriting gossip, jokes, business negotiations, arguments about money, all addressed to a man who could only answer back in his own voice, never able to hear the reply. By his late 40s, most historians agree, Beethoven was functionally, almost completely deaf. A love without a name. Deafness was not the only mystery Beethoven left behind. In 1812, he wrote a long, passionate, unsent love letter, addressed only to "my immortal beloved," never naming the woman he was writing to. The letter was found in a hidden compartment in his death, alongside the Heiligenstadt Testament. Historians have spent nearly 2 centuries trying to identify her. Several candidates fit the timeline and circumstances. Josephine Brunswick, a woman he had loved years earlier and continued to correspond with. Antony Brentano, a married woman he was close to during the exact period the letter was written, and a handful of others. No definitive proof has ever surfaced, and it likely never will. What the letter does tell us, definitively, is something about the emotional cost of the man's condition. Beethoven never married. He proposed unsuccessfully more than once. Several of the women in his circle later suggested that his deafness, his poverty in earlier years, and his difficult temperament, all combined, made him believe a stable domestic life was simply not available to him. He wrote elsewhere that he envied friends with families, and that he had made peace, however painfully, with the likelihood that he would grow old alone. He was wrong about that last part, although not in the way anyone would have wished. The War Over Karl. In November of 1815, Beethoven's younger brother, an amateur musician who had gone into business and built a modest fortune, died of tuberculosis, leaving behind a 9-year-old son named Karl and a widow named Johanna. Beethoven, convinced that Johanna was an unfit mother, morally and financially, launched a legal campaign to remove the boy from her custody entirely. What followed was nearly 5 years of vicious, exhausting litigation, played out in Vienna's civil and imperial courts, full of accusations, forged evidence, courtroom reversals, and bitter testimony from nearly everyone who knew the family. Beethoven, at points, referred to his own sister-in-law as the Queen of the Night, borrowing the villain's title from Mozart's opera, and made little effort to hide his contempt for her in writing. He eventually won primary custody. It did not bring him the peace he expected. Beethoven, now deaf, increasingly isolated, and utterly unprepared for parenting, tried to mold his nephew into a musical prodigy in his own image, moved him between schools, monitored his every relationship, and by most accounts, smothered him with a combination of genuine love and suffocating control. Karl did not want to be molded.
Yes, Uncle.
The relationship between uncle and nephew, played out for years across those same handwritten conversation books, would become one of the defining sources of anguish in the final chapter of Beethoven's life. Silence and the Ninth. By the early 1820s, Beethoven could no longer hear ordinary conversation in any form, hearing aid or otherwise. And it was during these years of total or near total silence that he composed some of the most demanding and revolutionary music of his career. The late string quartets, the Missa Solemnis, and the Ninth Symphony, the piece that would introduce a full chorus into a symphony for the first time in the form's history. On the evening of May 7, 1824, the Ninth Symphony premiered in Vienna to an overflowing concert hall. Beethoven stood on stage alongside the official conductor, following his own score, silently mouthing the tempo cues to the orchestra out of habit, unable to hear a single note of the performance he had spent years composing. When the final movement ended, the audience erupted. Contemporary accounts, though not universally agreed upon in every detail, describe Beethoven still facing the orchestra, completely unaware that the piece had finished, until one of the singers gently turned him around by the shoulder so he could see, rather than hear, the audience on its feet, applauding. Several witnesses describe him weeping. It remains one of the most quoted moments in the history of music. A man who could not hear the ovation for a piece the entire world would go on to celebrate for the next 2 centuries. But even as his art reached new heights, his body, quietly and separately, had already begun its own decline. The body fails. The body turns against him. Beethoven's medical history, independent of his hearing, reads like a long, grim catalog. From his 20s onward, friends and doctors documented chronic abdominal pain, violent bouts of diarrhea, recurring fevers, and headaches so severe he sometimes could not work for days. In his later years, visitors began to notice a yellowish tint to his skin and eyes, a classic sign of jaundice and liver trouble. He drank. By the standards of his era, his wine consumption was not considered unusually extreme. Most middle-class Viennese men drank daily, but Beethoven's intake was steady and significant across his adult life, and his letters and conversation books both make casual references to wine as a near-daily companion. Combined with chronic gastrointestinal disease, it placed a slow, cumulative strain on his liver that would only worsen with time. His doctors, working with the medical knowledge of the early 1800s, tried treatment after treatment, purges, bloodletting, mineral baths, dietary restrictions, none of them addressing a cause they could not identify, because the tools to identify it simply did not exist yet. Beethoven grew, by his own account, deeply distrustful of physicians, switching doctors repeatedly, convinced, not without reason, that they didn't actually understand what was wrong with him. By his mid-50s, a man who had spent 3 decades as one of the most famous musicians alive was quietly, privately, running out of time. He did not yet know it. Neither did anyone around him. Storm at Gneixendorf. In the summer of 1826, the tension with his nephew Karl reached a breaking point. Karl, now 20 years old, deeply unhappy under his uncle's control and drowning in debt, attempted to take his own life on a hillside outside Vienna. He survived, though barely, and the scandal that followed forced Beethoven to finally, permanently loosen his grip. That autumn, hoping to help Karl recover away from Vienna's gossip, Beethoven traveled with his nephew to stay at the country estate of his surviving younger brother in a village called Gneixendorf. Contemporary accounts describe weeks of arguments between the brothers over money and living arrangements, with Beethoven, by now increasingly frail, caught in the middle. In early December, the visit collapsed into a full quarrel, and Beethoven insisted on leaving immediately, rather than wait for proper transportation. He and Karl were forced to travel back to Vienna in an open, unheated milk wagon, through freezing winter weather, over a journey that took roughly 2 days. By the time they reached the city, Beethoven was seriously ill, likely with pneumonia, and he never fully recovered. The long decline. The final 4 months of Beethoven's life were a slow, brutal siege on his body. The lung infection from the winter journey triggered a cascading collapse. His liver, already damaged from years of chronic disease, could no longer function properly, and fluid began to build up in his abdomen, a condition doctors of the time called dropsy. Between December of 1826 and March of 1827, physicians performed 4 separate surgical procedures to drain that fluid directly from his abdomen, using primitive instruments and no real anesthesia beyond what alcohol or opium could offer. Accounts describe gallons of fluid removed in a single sitting. One of the punctures became infected. Beethoven, in visible agony, reportedly joked with his doctor that he would rather face a battlefield than another operation. He remained mentally sharp through much of this ordeal, dictating letters, reviewing contracts for his final compositions, and receiving a steady stream of visitors, friends, fellow musicians, and admirers who had heard the great composer was dying and came to pay their respects while they still could. He was, by every account, aware that he was running out of time, and he spent a portion of it settling his affairs, including finally formally naming Karl as his sole heir. Final days. By mid-March of 1827, Beethoven had grown too weak to leave his bed. Friends who visited described a man wasted almost beyond recognition, his once powerful frame reduced to skin over bone, his skin a deep, jaundiced yellow. And yet, visitors also describe flashes of the old defiance and even dark humor breaking through the suffering. On March 24th, a priest administered the last rites. Beethoven reportedly thanked him with unusual courtesy and remarked to a friend afterward in Latin, "Plaudite, amici, commedia finita est," roughly translated as, "Applaud, my friends, the comedy is over," a line traditionally used to close a stage performance in the Vienna of his day. Whether he meant it as gallows humor about his own life or simply as a reflex quotation remains, like so much else about him, disputed. A case of Rhenish wine, sent by a publisher who hoped it might lift the dying composer's spirits, arrived at his bedside on March 24th or 25th. Beethoven is said to have looked at the bottles and murmured with dry resignation, "Pity, pity, too late." He never touched them. Death and burial. Thunder over Vienna. On the afternoon of March 26, 1827, Beethoven slipped into a coma. Only a handful of people remained in the apartment. His sister-in-law Johanna, a young family friend named Anselm Hottenbrenner, and possibly his secretary. Karl, the nephew he had fought so hard to raise, was away in Moravia with his military regiment and was not present. Late in the afternoon, a violent thunderstorm broke over the city, lightning splitting the sky directly above his apartment building. According to Huttenbrenner's own written account, at the height of the storm, a single enormous crack of thunder shook the room, and Beethoven, unconscious for hours, suddenly opened his eyes, raised a clenched fist toward the ceiling for several seconds, and then fell back onto the pillow. He was dead within minutes. It was shortly before 6 o'clock in the evening. He was 56 years old. Whether the detail about the fist and the thunderclap is literal truth or a flourish added by a witness who understood, even in the moment, that he was watching history, historians still debate. What isn't in dispute is the date, the storm, and the silence that followed it, in a room that had spent a quarter-century fighting against silence of a very different kind. The city says goodbye. News of Beethoven's death spread through Vienna within hours, and the response was, by the standards of the era, extraordinary. On March 29, 1827, an estimated crowd of between 10 and 20,000 people lined the streets for his funeral procession, an almost unimaginable turnout for a private citizen, let alone a musician, in a city of roughly 300,000. Schools closed for the day. Soldiers were brought in to help manage the crowd. 8 singers and a small orchestra performed specially composed funeral music as the coffin moved slowly from his apartment building through the streets of Vienna toward the Alserkirche for a blessing, before continuing on to the Wading Cemetery on the city's outskirts. Torchbearers walking beside the coffin reportedly included some of the most prominent musicians in Vienna at the time. It was, by any measure, one of the largest public funerals the city had ever seen for someone who was not royalty. The irony was not lost on those who attended. A man who had spent the final third of his life unable to hear applause was being mourned by tens of thousands of people who had come, in effect, to applaud him one final time. A lock of hair. The following morning, March 27th, a local physician performed an autopsy, hoping in part to finally answer the question that had haunted Beethoven's inner circle for years. What exactly had been wrong with him? The findings were grim and specific. His liver was shrunken and hardened, consistent with advanced cirrhosis. His spleen was enlarged. His pancreas showed signs of chronic disease. Even his auditory nerves were examined and described as shrunken and lacking in normal structure, a detail that intrigued the doctors present, though the medicine of 1827 had no way to interpret it fully. That same week, in the hours and days around his death, several visitors and admirers requested a small, macabre keepsake, a lock of the composer's hair, cut and preserved as a memorial. One of the more famous of these locks was taken by a 15-year-old piano student who had come to pay his respects, a young admirer who would go on to become a respected musician in his own right. He kept the lock, and eventually it was passed down through his family for generations. For most of the next 150 years, these hair samples were treated as sentimental relics, historical curiosities tucked into private collections, occasionally displayed, never scientifically useful. Nobody yet had the tools to make them talk. What science found.
This visualization
The hair speaks. That changed at the turn of the 21st century. Beginning in the early 2000s, several authenticated locks of Beethoven's hair were acquired by research institutions and subjected for the first time to modern forensic and genetic analysis. What they found rewrote large parts of this story. The first major result came from chemical toxicology. Laboratory testing found levels of lead in the composer's hair dramatically higher than what would be considered normal. In some authenticated samples, dozens of times the expected background level. Lead exposure in the 19th century was disturbingly common. Lead-lined wine vessels, lead-sweetened cheap wine, lead-glazed dishware, and even certain medical treatments of the era, some of which Beethoven is documented to have used, could all have contributed. Chronic lead exposure is a well-documented cause of gastrointestinal disease, kidney damage, and, notably, hearing loss and nerve damage, matching several of Beethoven's own lifelong symptoms disturbingly well. Then, in 2023, an international team of geneticists sequenced Beethoven's genome directly from an authenticated hair sample, the first time this had ever been done for a composer of his stature. The results, published in a major scientific journal, revealed a strong genetic predisposition toward liver disease and, more surprisingly, clear evidence that Beethoven had been infected with hepatitis B in the months before his death. In combination with his documented drinking habits and this newly discovered genetic vulnerability, the researchers concluded they had found a highly plausible, evidence-based explanation for the catastrophic liver failure that killed him. The same genetic study delivered one more twist. When researchers compared Beethoven's Y chromosome to that of living relatives who share his family name, they found no match at all. Evidence of an unrecorded break somewhere in the paternal line, generations before Ludwig was even born. It solved nothing about his death, but it added one more small permanent mystery to a family history already full of them. So what really killed him? So back to the question we started with. Did Beethoven's deafness kill him? Not directly, and not in the way the phrase suggests. The two conditions were not, strictly speaking, cause and effect, but the mounting scientific evidence points towards something more unsettling than a simple answer, and possibly more interesting: a shared root cause. The chemical evidence for significant lead exposure across much of Beethoven's adult life is now considered strong by most researchers who have studied the hair samples, even as some caution that lead alone cannot be proven to be the sole cause of either his deafness or his death. Chronic lead poisoning is independently capable of damaging the auditory nerve, causing exactly the kind of progressive distorted hearing loss Beethoven described for nearly 30 years. That same chronic exposure, layered on top of a genetic vulnerability to liver disease and an active hepatitis B infection, would have placed relentless, compounding stress on his liver and kidneys for decades, culminating in the organ failure that ultimately killed him in March of 1827. In other words, the current scientific consensus is not that deafness caused his death, but that both his deafness and his death may trace back, at least in part, to the same slow poison moving quietly through his body for most of his adult life. A poison nobody in 1827 had any way of detecting, and one that modern science only uncovered 2 centuries later, hidden inside a few strands of preserved hair. It is not a perfectly clean answer. Genuine historical mysteries rarely offer one, but it is, for the first time in 200 years, an answer built on physical evidence rather than speculation, and it reframes Beethoven's entire adult life, not as 2 unrelated tragedies stacked on top of each other, but as a single, slow-moving one, endured for nearly 3 decades by a man who kept composing anyway. Legacy. Beethoven never heard most of his own late masterpieces performed. He never heard the Ninth Symphony's final ovation, never heard his string quartets played by the musicians who premiered them, never heard, in any conventional sense, the music that would go on to define what a symphony, a sonata, a string quartet could even be, for every composer who came after him. And yet that music has now been heard by more people across more countries in more languages than almost any other body of work in human history. It has been played at coronations and funerals, at Olympic ceremonies and prison uprisings, adopted as an anthem by nations that did not exist in his lifetime. It survived him by 2 centuries and shows no sign of stopping. There is something almost unbearably fitting about that. A man robbed slowly and cruelly of the one sense his entire profession depended on, who spent his final 30 years composing music he could feel more than hear, ended up giving the rest of the world something it would hear forever. The silence was his. The sound became everyone else's. That's where we'll leave the case of Ludwig van Beethoven. Not fully solved in the way a courtroom drama resolves, but genuinely, meaningfully, better understood than it was even 20 years ago. If you want to keep investigating history's great unanswered questions with us, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next case.